Werner, W-E-R-N-E-R, S as in Sam, P-I-T-Z.
Good morning, Dr. Spitz.
Good morning, sir.
Could you tell again, I know you just did it, but for the purposes of this record, would you introduce yourself to the court and jury?
My name is Werner Spitz. I'm a medical doctor.
And Dr. Spitz, do you practice a specific specialty within the practice of medicine?
Yes, I do.
And could you tell the jury what that is?
I'm a physician that specialized in the field of pathology and forensic pathology.
Could you tell the court and jury first what the field of, is forensic pathology a subspecialty of pathology?
Yes.
Why don't you tell us?
Forensic pathology is a recognized specialty, but it's part, in order to be a forensic pathologist, a physician has to be a pathologist first.
And what is the medical specialty of pathology?
Pathology is the study of the nature and causes of disease, and pathologists work in hospitals. They examine tissues and body fluids and report the results of their examination to the records. The results are entered into the records of the patient, and the clinicians then understand what is wrong with the patient. And a pathologist will do an autopsy on a person that dies in a hospital if the family gives permission for such an examination. A forensic pathologist, a pathologist needs 4 or 5 years to become specialized, and during that time, he or she works in a hospital, and the hospital is approved by the American Board of Pathology for such training. And a forensic pathologist does another year of specialized training in an institution so approved for such training. And a forensic pathologist primarily works with the police and may only perform autopsies on people who have died and where the death is suspicious, that it may not be natural causes, like in a hospital.
We also hear the word coroner often. Is that the same thing as forensic pathologist?
Essentially, it is the same. The coroner is an elected official in most jurisdictions, and the coroner tells the pathologist to do an autopsy. In other jurisdictions, there's no coroner. The medical examiner is both the coroner, quote unquote, and also the medical examiner embodied in one person. The coroner essentially determines when an autopsy is necessary. And then he or she, the coroner, determines the cause and manner of death. Manner meaning homicide, suicide, natural causes, or accident. But in many jurisdictions, like where I come from in Michigan, we do not have coroners. The medical examiner does all the jobs.
Explain to us that the job of a forensic pathologist or coroner is to determine the manner and the cause of death. How are they involved in the investigation of death?
Well, before anything happens with the body, somebody has died, and the death is now a coroner's case because there are questions about how this death occurred. The coroner or the coroner's investigators will investigate the circumstances under which this patient or this person has died and report to the coroner. The coroner then decides, based on the circumstances, whether an autopsy is necessary. If an autopsy is necessary, then he will ask his pathologist, the pathologist that works for the coroner's office, to perform an autopsy. This pathologist will report his results of the autopsy to the coroner, and the coroner will then issue a death certificate where he or she determines the cause of death, which are the medical reasons for the death, and the manner of the death, whether the death is homicide, suicide, natural causes, or accident, or maybe undeterminable. And how the injury, if there was an injury, how the damage to the body occurred.
Tell us about your medical training. Where did you get your medical training?
I got my medical training to become a physician. First 4 years in the medical school of Geneva, Switzerland, and then, because of political reasons, I had to transfer back where I went to school before that, to the Hebrew University Hadassah Medical School in Jerusalem, Israel. And that's where I graduated after another 3 years of work as a medical student, so a total of 7 years.
And then after that, how do you become a specialist in
pathology? Then I started a residency in pathology. I said before that if you want to be a forensic pathologist, you have to be a pathologist first. So I worked in a large government hospital to learn pathology, and worked there for several years, 4 or 5 years. Actually, 6 years. And then that was like that pathology office where I worked also included the medical examiner's office or the coroner's office. And they moved out, that entity, the coroner's entity, moved out into a special building, and I moved with them. And from then on, I was a forensic pathologist.
By the way, just so we're clear, and pathology is a branch of medicine. It's involved also in the treatment of living patients, is it not?
Of course, because the pathologist will never do an autopsy unless he has reviewed the medical records. Of course, he is a physician, so he did a residency. In the residency, you're trained how the findings of on the patient jive with the medical records. You have to put that all together in order to make a diagnosis.
Where were you getting that training that you were talking about, a large government hospital in the United States when you first came here?
Oh, when I first came to the United States, that was in 1959, and I worked for the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner of the state of Maryland, and I worked there for 2 years. Then I had to leave the country because I came here on the wrong kind of permit, on the wrong kind of visa. I came as a visitor because it was not my intention to immigrate. But then I realized that there's much more going on in this country than there was in the little country of Israel. So I wanted to continue to work here for the rest of my professional life, and I'm still doing it.
And where did you go from there then?
Then I went to Germany, to Berlin, to West Berlin, because I was born in Germany, and I worked there for 2 years. That was the legal requirement by the American authorities. And then I came back to Baltimore, and when I was in Berlin, I worked at the so-called coroner's office or medical examiner's office. Only there it was associated with the university, with the medical school. And after that, I came back to Baltimore, and I worked there until 1972 as in Baltimore at the medical examiner's office. First as assistant medical examiner, then as the deputy chief medical examiner for the state of Maryland. and I was associate professor for the Johns Hopkins University, the Johns Hopkins University and the University of Maryland.
Is there any dispute that this isn't a qualified expert?
No, but I just...
Okay, can we shorten this up, please?
Sure. Just briefly then, explain to the court and jury your professional employment, where you've been working since then.
Well, since then I was working, in 1972 I came to Michigan and I was the chief medical examiner for the county of Wayne, which is Detroit and suburbs. And at the same time I also was the pathologist and later on the medical examiner for the county of Macomb, which is another county to the north of where I live. And I held the position at Wayne County for 16 and a half years, and then I moved full-time to the county of Macomb, and I worked there for just about 32 years. And then in 2004, I retired from the second position. In 1988, I retired from the first position, from the Detroit position. And now I'm doing forensic pathology privately and on a consultant basis from 2004.
Even when you were employed as the medical examiner for Wayne County, the largest county in Michigan, how many people in that county?
In Michigan, about 10 million.
Did you also do private autopsies?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
And I still do.
Right. So the work that you're doing subsequent to that employment is the same as you've always done?
Yes, I do less autopsies, but I do autopsies regardless.
Tell the court and jury how many autopsies you've done.
I have either performed myself or because of the fact that the medical examiner's offices in Maryland and in Michigan were training institutions where we were approved by the American Board of Pathology to train pathologists who wanted to be forensic pathologists. I had supervised those people. So between those autopsies I did myself and those that I supervised and stood with the residents explaining to them, I have participated in 60,000 cases.
Are you board certified, doctor?
Yes,
Tell
I'm
the court and jury
certified.
what that is.
I'm certified by examination by the American Board of Pathology in anatomic pathology, which is the type of pathology that is practiced in a hospital. And I'm also certified by the American Board of Pathology in forensic pathology. The first was in 1961. The second was in 1965. The difference is because, as I said before, I had to leave the country for 2 years, and the examination is only given once a year.
Where are you licensed, doctor?
I'm licensed to practice medicine in Maryland, Virginia, the District of Columbia, that is Washington, D.C., Michigan, and all the European Union countries.
You also teach, do you not? You're a professor.
Yes, I'm in Michigan. When I came, I was offered the position of associate professor of pathology, and I was subsequently promoted to full professorship in the Department of Pathology, and I still hold that position. I'm also adjunct professor of chemistry, teaching toxicology at the University of Windsor in Windsor, Ontario, Canada.
Your curriculum vitae, your resume indicates scores and scores of journal articles that you've written. Are you familiar with the term learned treatises?
Yes.
What is that?
A learned treatise is either an article, but usually a book that a physician, for example, in my profession, a physician, a pathologist, a forensic pathologist, will author or edit to educate other people, other people in the same line of work.
And you've written numerous articles.
I've
Have you not?
written 96 scientific articles, most of which are, by far most of which are peer-reviewed articles. That means they have to be reviewed by other physicians in order to be accepted, to be printed. And I've also authored and edited a textbook that was first published in 1972, then in 1980, then in 1993, and then in 2006. And I believe you are holding the last edition.
This is the textbook?
Yes.
Medical Legal Investigation of Death?
Yes, application of pathology to crime investigation.
And who is it used by, Dr. Spitz?
I'm sorry?
Who is the book used by?
The book is used by pathologists, by forensic pathologists, by lawyers, in courtrooms, by defense lawyers, by prosecutors, by plaintiff lawyers, and by forensic nurses. There is such a specialty. It is used in medical schools and law schools, and I'm glad to say it is used worldwide.
Doctor, you've also testified hundreds of times, have you not?
I have testified many, many times in all level courts, either directly in courtrooms or by depositions in federal court and state court, all over the country and in other countries as well.
Some of the cases you've asked have been participated in. You were on the select committee for assassinations,
yes,
investigating the death of President Kennedy?
Yes, I should have said, I've testified before the U.S. Congress in the assassination of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King as well.
You were involved in the case of John Benet Ramsey?
I was.
What was your involvement there?
I worked for the police in Boulder, Colorado, and reviewed the materials. I did not do an autopsy, and reviewed all the materials and advised them which way they required to promote their investigation.
And you testified against O.J. Simpson?
I did.
In the civil case?
In the civil case.
I've marked as proposed Exhibit 23 your curriculum vitae. Is this a true and accurate copy kept in the ordinary course of your business, Doctor?
It is.
Move for admission of proposed Exhibit 23.
I don't have any objection.
Received.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Spitz, how were you contacted to participate in this case and provide expert opinions regarding the death of Terry Bruner?
Your office contacted me by telephone and asked me if I would review a case which came to their attention, and they were seeking my opinions on the cause and the way Mr. Bruner died.
Okay. Is that what you were asked to do within your particular field of expertise?
That is the usual way that I'm being contacted. Sometimes I get a letter, sometimes I get an email, but essentially it's the same way.
Okay. And what were you asked to do relative to the death of Mr. Bruner?
To review
investigate, I should say. What were you asked in terms of your expertise to investigate?
To review the material and to apply my knowledge of medicine and pathology and forensic pathology to to explain how this individual died and why he died and of what he died. What are the conditions that led to his death?
Very good. In doing so, and in coming to opinions and conclusions so that you can eventually come to court, what materials did you review in order to come to opinions and conclusions?
I reviewed, as a forensic pathologist will always do, the circumstances, the statements of people that are knowledgeable in how Mr. Bruner was, how he became ill, how how the disease developed in him, and how he died eventually, and whether the death was preventable, maybe, or not preventable. All these issues you wanted to know, and everybody else wants to know too.
What did you review? What materials did you review?
I reviewed the medical records, the statements of people that had a contact with Mr. Bruner. I reviewed other expert opinions. I reviewed depositions of people who were in the know of the medical condition of Mr. Bruner. I reviewed some photographs. I reviewed microscopic slides of the autopsy. Microscopic slides meaning that when an autopsy is done, tissue is kept, and then this material is viewed in the microscope. And I reviewed that. And I reviewed the autopsy report. I reviewed autopsy photographs. I think that's about it.
Was that was it sufficient to come to a conclusion and opinion in this case?
Yes, I think so.
Let's start, Doctor, by talking about what is your opinion with regard to the cause, and that's, I think, what we're primarily going to cover today in your testimony. What is the cause, or what was the cause of Mr. Bruner's death?
Mr. Bruner died as a result of an acquired infection, pneumonia, which then precipitated what is known as bacteremia, where bacteria enter the bloodstream, and sepsis, and he developed meningitis because this poisonous material of the bacteria and the bacteria themselves circulate in the blood, and he eventually developed meningitis, and which is an inflammation of the membranes surrounding the brain. And the brain, as a result of that, swelled up tremendously and herniated. And I would be glad to explain what that means. But in the meantime, let me just say it herniated. That means as a result of the swelling, it expanded and parts of the brain were caught between other parts and strangled as a result of that. This would need some more explanation to understand what that means. And that is eventually what caused the death.
Okay. So let's go back just for a second. What were the conditions you indicated existed in him? The names of the
The names of the condition is in the latter part of his life. He was 46.
Now, let me ask you that first. Tell us, did he suffer from any pre-existing health conditions?
He did.
What were they?
He suffered as a physician, I would call it a disease. He suffered of alcoholism. And as a result of the alcoholism, he developed cirrhosis. And the cirrhosis means that the liver undergoes scarring gradually. And this process of alcoholism extended over many years, and eventually he developed extensive cirrhosis. And this has certain complications. One of the complications is that people develop a suppression of the bone marrow, and that causes certain infections to take hold of the body. Like in this case, he developed pneumonia, and in both lungs, in large areas. And the pneumonia, then people who have pneumonia have a temperature, and when they have a temperature, they are reacting to the presence of these poisonous materials in the body that the bacteria that cause the pneumonia generate. Only now they're in the blood, and all this is circulating through the body, but the bacteria settle in certain places, and in this case settled in the coverings of the brain, and when that occurs, the blood vessels on the surface of the brain are also part and parcel of the infection that is going on there, and the blood doesn't circulate as well, and when the blood doesn't circulate as well through the coverings of the brain, then the brain swells up because the blood flows in and doesn't flow out as well as it did under normal circumstances. Brain becomes bigger, and there's only so much space in the skull. It's like an organ in a box, and a very rigid box, a bony box, which is the skull. And as a result of that, the brain herniates. Herniates means that it goes into nooks and crannies which normally are not, there's no brain in there, there's space. There's fluid over the surface of the brain, called the spinal fluid, which is in the head and also in the vertebral column around the spinal cord, so that this fluid protects the brain from rattling and protects the spinal cord from rattling. And all this became infected, and he died as a result of that. Because when the brain swells as tremendously as it did here, the brain goes up and sideways and downward. And in the bottom part of the back of the brain, what is called the brain stem, there are the vital centers. There's a center that controls the breathing, and a center which controls the activity of the heart, the heartbeat, and the heartbeat then goes haywire, and the breathing gets suppressed, and eventually the person dies.
By the way, is that a quick process, or is that a prolonged process?
The very end is a quick process, but it has to it takes time for the swelling to occur, for the infection to take hold. That is a tedious, nasty process that leads to a gradual termination.
Is that a process that shows symptoms? You know what the word symptoms means?
Of course it does. It shows a...
I hate to interrupt, but there's nothing in the report about what symptoms may be shown during this process, getting beyond the scope of this expert's disclosed opinion. He's wrong.
Well, I'd have the report in front of me. Can you show me where he talks about symptoms?
Page 2. Bacterial meningitis is a treatable condition which usually responds to IV antibiotic therapy. Ample time existed for such treatment, was instituted too late. By the time administration of antibiotics was...
I don't want you to read his report into the record. What you're talking about doesn't relate to symptoms.
If you go on, it does.
Okay, can you just tell me what paragraph you're referring to?
Third full paragraph on page 2, beginning with the word beginning, well, I think it's all one sentence if it's not, but it's certainly relating to the processes of dying, unconsciousness, unawareness, profound mental changes, no response to painful stimuli. I mean,
I'm not sure we're looking at the same report. I don't see anything about that on page 2. Counsel, would you approach?
Do these conditions that you indicated that existed in Mr. Bruner display symptoms?
Of course they do.
Could you explain how?
Pneumonia is a twofold.
Not to interrupt. I think we discussion we had went to disclose symptoms, now we're talking about pneumonia, maybe questions need to be phrased differently. So we
I,
can get the problem.
I agree. I think we're going to end up right back at the bench if you approach it in this way.
Did you say pneumonia is one of the conditions that he suffered from?
Yes,
Okay. What are the symptoms of pneumonia?
of course they were.
All right, it's not in the report.
What?
You're prepared to know what the witnesses are going to say, and I object to going outside the matters of the report.
If there's anything in the report about the symptoms of pneumonia, you can point that out to me and we'll address it.
Respiratory complications.
It doesn't say pneumonia.
No, it doesn't say pneumonia because it's obvious it's pneumonia. That's the respiratory complications. He described the conditions before that, in the page before that. He didn't write this report the way I'm testifying. He wrote the report. He talked about streptococcal pneumonia on the page before that.
Counsel, would you
Your Honor.
approach?
Did you indicate that Mr. Bruner had pneumonia?
Yes, I did.
Tell us what pneumonia is.
Pneumonia is an infection of the lung. And it is one of the exceptions normally when you want to say in medical terminology, you want to say that there is an inflammation. The word ends with itis, like otitis, meaning inflammation of the ear, or other inflammations. Pneumonia is an exception. Pneumonia is a medical term meaning inflammation of the lung. The bacteria settle in the air spaces. The lung is made up of lots and lots and lots of air spaces, of little areas which contain the air that we breathe in. When bacteria settle in there, inflammation starts, and instead of there being air in there, there is now inflammatory products, bacteria, waste products that the bacteria generate, etc. So that interferes with the breathing process. In addition to that, the toxic products that are in the lung circulate through the body because they get absorbed by the bloodstream and they settle other places and create other complications, such as in this case the
We're there now on question. I think next question ought to be voted.
I agree. Go ahead. What's your next question?
By the way, when we talk about the end cause of Mr. Bruner's death, I think you indicated there was a progression. Pneumonia. Say that?
pneumonia
Sepsis.
caused sepsis and bacteremia.
What's bacteria?
Bacteremia means that the bacteria settles in the bloodstream. And that created meningitis.
Well, all of these things, these conditions, all led up to the same end.
Exactly. And it is important for me to indicate to you, since I mentioned it before, that the presence of the inflammation in the coverings of the brain, in those membranes, in other words, the meningitis, that caused brain swelling, and the brain swelling caused herniation.
All these things are
They are all connected. They are all one.
Okay. Now, getting back to the cirrhosis, medical records of this have also indicated condition or a disease known as hepatitis C. Did you see that?
Yes.
What is that?
Hepatitis C is, there are various bacteria, various agents that will cause inflammation of the liver, so-called hepatitis. And hepatitis A, there's hepatitis A, there's hepatitis B, there's hepatitis C. And each one of them is caused by a different organism. Hepatitis C can be received from transfusions, where people from a hepatitis C patient give blood, and that blood gets transfused into another person, and that person gets hepatitis C. You can get hepatitis C from other causes too, but that is one not unusual one. The getting hepatitis C in this fashion. And when they asked Mr. Bruner, what is your medical history, at one point, he...
All right. You have to put it into a negative or a narrative, and I think it's beyond the scope of the question. I ask the witness to find his answers to the questions asked.
I agree. Yes, we're waiting for a question.
What, in the records that you reviewed, is it clear that
It is
those
clear.
conditions are disclosed?
It is clear that he indicated on questioning him that he had hepatitis C.
Your Honor, I apologize for interrupting, but I think we're getting again beyond the scope of the report, and I think intentionally so. I don't know how to handle it, but I do object again and ask that the witness be admonished not to go beyond the scope of the report.
This is not opinions. This is the foundation for the opinions. He said he reviewed the medical records. These are facts contained in the medical records.
I don't see anything in his report about hepatitis C, and you didn't ask him about what opinions he relied on or what facts or data he relied on, so the objection is sustained.
Doctor, did I not ask you at the beginning of the exam what information that you relied upon in order to give your opinions in this case?
Yes, you did.
And did you disclose the documents, including the Sedgwick records, the Via Christi records,
Yes,
the
I did.
autopsy records?
And
And do you, by the way, disclose that review in your report, too?
I did.
You did. And contained within those records is the fact that Mr. Bruner disclosed hepatitis C?
That's correct.
Okay, that's not an opinion of yours, that's just a fact, isn't
That's
it?
correct. I did nothing to determine whether he had this or that hepatitis, but the record indicates hepatitis C.
Right. And insofar as the records indicate cirrhosis and hepatitis C, does that indicate or does that make a human being more susceptible to the conditions that you indicated just a moment ago he had?
Yes, it does.
Tell
because it suppresses the immune system.
Okay. Tell us why or how having an immune system suppression will make anybody, any person, more susceptible to disease.
Well, if the immune system is suppressed, then the normal mechanisms of protection that the body has built into it are not functional as well.
Counsel, will you approach again, please?
Now, explain to us, if you would, how being susceptible or being immunocompromised makes a person susceptible to a disease or a infection.
The normal mechanisms that every healthy person has to fight back certain types of inflammations and other conditions that require a well-functional immune system. If the immune system is suppressed, then this response to an inflammation in the body is defective. It's not as functional, and the inflammation can proceed without as much interference as it normally would.
Now, was there found, in this case, an initial bacteria or an organism that was determined by the medical examiner to be the causative, and via Christie and all the doctors? Is there an agreement as to what the bacteria was?
Yes.
What is
that? It's Streptococcus pneumonia.
What is that?
It's a common bacteria that generates pneumonia.
Okay. And how is it usually treated?
It's treated by antibiotics.
As simple as that?
It is responsive. This condition responds to the common antibiotics, and those antibiotics should be effective in treating it.
If it's not treated, when somebody gets sick, do they develop pneumonia?
Well, they develop pneumonia, and the pneumonia is rampant and develops into a condition called lobar pneumonia. Lobar, normally pneumonia is patches, a little here, a little there, a little everywhere. But here, the pneumonia is described microscopically, and I saw it too, as lobar pneumonia. The lung has 2 lobes on the left side and 3 lobes on the right side, and a whole lobe of the lung is involved in lobar pneumonia. Consequently, why that is important is because each lobe is there for a purpose, namely to get air in, to retrieve the oxygen, and to put out carbon dioxide. And when the space is taken up by inflammation, that area cannot breathe, because the spaces, the air spaces, are taken up by products of inflammation, bacteria and toxic products, instead of air.
Explain to us then, in terms of pneumonia, what are the symptoms that somebody would see?
The symptoms are that person...
I don't think that's in the report, Your Honor. I thought we had that discussion.
We did. Objection sustained.
Paragraph, or the last page, second full paragraph.
We did have this discussion. You can ask him about what's in the report, and I think what the report says is that he had respiratory complications as a result of brain swelling. Is that what you're asking about?
No.
Okay. What are you talking about? Mental status changes?
No. I'm talking about the last page of the report. This was a prolonged process lasting days.
Counsel?
Weeks. What?
You know the court has already ruled on his ability to testify about the matters contained in that paragraph.
No, well, Your Honor, that only the last part, the first part of that paragraph refers to the symptomatology prior to that. It's not, that paragraph isn't simply about without saying anything, can we approach the bench again? Because that paragraph...
Okay, you asked him about the symptoms of pneumonia. That paragraph doesn't say anything about the symptoms of pneumonia, so the objection is sustained.
I'm now asking about he got progressively worse.
That wasn't your question, so why don't you ask that if that's your question?
did he get worse, progressively worse?
Yes, the pneumonia does not start off.
Now, beyond the scope of the question, I'm fearful that we're just using this as a way to get around the
Right. That was a yes or no question. I think he's answered it. Go ahead. Next question.
How did he get progressively worse?
Because the inflammation in the lung does not start with the peak, it starts with a small area and it grows. And it takes up more space and more space and more space. And it spreads throughout the body.
And by the way, you indicated that he got noticeably progressively worse. What did you mean by that?
What I mean by that is that if you or I or anyone with or without medical education will look at that person, they will determine that that person is severely sick.
It says exactly that.
Counsel, it does say exactly that. Objections overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. Then, in terms of the noticeable progression, where did it progress from there? Where does sepsis come in? Is that part of pneumonia?
That is part of pneumonia. When somebody has pneumonia, they have a temperature. When they have a temperature, they have sweating. When they have sweating, they feel it, and the people around them.
I think I've told you 3 times, Mr. Feiger, that he's not going to testify about the symptoms of pneumonia.
I know, he's talking about sepsis now. He's talking about how
Maybe I
pneumonia
misheard that,
turns
but
into sepsis.
I thought he said pneumonia.
No, I asked, how does pneumonia turn into what? Sepsis is what, sir? Let's just define it again.
Sepsis are the toxic products of bacteria that involve a certain part of the body. When those toxic products enter the bloodstream and circulate throughout the bloodstream, throughout the body, that is a condition called sepsis.
Okay. And how does that then noticeably progress into meningitis, or is it the same thing?
It's noticeably part of the problem. It's not an important issue as to what lay people would understand or wouldn't understand. This person has never been designated. Opinions have been provided on that subject. I think we're trying to get into that, both with the witness and counsel. I object to the question that's been raised. It's beyond the report.
You just ruled it is in the report, noticeably, and that's what he meant by it. And there's never been any question about what he meant by it and what this case is about.
That is absolutely untrue, Your Honor, and it's not in the report.
I think he's entitled to testify that preceding March 10th of 2008, he's entitled to testify that on March 10th, 2008, he got noticeably, progressively worse.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Talking about one day. We're not talking about over a period of weeks.
Go ahead. So how did this progress then? Noticeably progress?
On March 10th.
Well, that's the relevance as to the defendants, but
Counsel, his report says what it says.
right. Go ahead. How did it noticeably progress?
On March 10th.
I think it says preceding March 10th.
Preceding March 10, when he got progressively, noticeably worse.
Right. What did you mean by that, Doctor?
The septic products, the toxic products from the inflammation in the lung got into the bloodstream and spread to the meninges, which are the coverings of the brain causing meningitis. And that created brain swelling, and that creates herniation, and that creates the death.
Okay. Now let's focus, as the court indicated, on March 10th. Describe to us your opinions as to how he got noticeably, progressively worse on the date of March 10th.
Eventually, he lost consciousness completely, and he presented the a uninterrupted process that led to the cessation of vital functions.
Okay. What led up to that? What was the progression, the noticeable progression on March 10th that led up to the complete unconsciousness? Go ahead.
You're talking about March 10th?
Yes. Go ahead.
Well, all I can say is more sepsis, more inflammation, more involvement of the brain the coverings of the brain, the meninges, more brain swelling.
And how would that be noticeable on March 10th?
Because he gets obtunded, meaning he gets totally unresponsive.
Before that,
I'm sorry?
before he becomes totally unresponsive, is there a progression on March 10th?
Before he becomes totally unresponsive, he is moaning, he is in pain, he is sweating, he is has a temperature, he is a dying individual.
In your opinion, on March 10th, was he worse and continuing to get worse throughout the day?
He is getting a lot worse, and he is eventually expiring from that condition, which gets worse and more worse and more worse.
In terms of how this is noticeable, does this appear like the flu, or is this...
No, it does not appear like the...
Your Honor, I didn't have an opportunity to object. It's beyond the scope of the report again, and I don't think it's proper for me to...
I agree. Objection sustained.
I want, hypothetically, if someone was to claim that this process looks like the flu, what would be your response?
Your Honor, I object, and I ask that counsel be admonished to stop getting into areas told he's not supposed to ask questions.
Where was I told not to ask questions about a hypothetical of claim that it looks like the flu?
Where does he, in his report, does he address whether the symptoms look like the flu?
He doesn't, because that's a negative. No one ever, that's the point, that's why in a report, we'd never have a report addressing, Your Honor, the negative, what the defendant's claims are.
I've ruled. Go ahead.
Explain to us in terms of how this would appear to somebody looking at it.
Interjections as before.
Noticeably appear.
Interjections as
I think he can testify as to the noticeable symptoms on March 10. I think he's already done that, but is there anything else he needs to cover?
Well, I want to cover it from beginning to, you sort of put it all at the, he became unconscious, obviously. It's noticeable to anybody if somebody's unconscious, maybe. But how does this progress on March 10th?
Sir, if I may compare this to a mountain where there is an up towards the peak, there's a peak, and then there is the slope down when the body shuts down. Before the body shuts down, it works itself up to the peak, and it stays at the peak for a while, and then the body shuts down. And that's exactly what I think that is, if I may say so, I'm pleased to have found this example because I think it illustrates the facts. The infection in the body culminates in a peak, and when it is at peak, the body that stays at peak for a while, because assume it is a rounded mountain, not a point at the top, and then body shuts down. The ascent, that means the climbing up, is gradual. The peak is steady, and the shutdown of the body is also gradual.
Is it painful?
It is painful.
How?
It is not only painful for the patient, but it's painful to look at him.
What do you mean?
Well, it's painful to look at somebody who is a dying person. He's a dying person. This patient was moaning. This-
I think that was...
Doctor, you do need to only answer the questions and not volunteer information.
That was the question, Doctor. What did you indicate from your review of the records that supports your opinion in terms of what was described?
But there are witness statements from people who were interviewed to give their perception of what happened. And there's a lady called Jones, and she said that he was lying in pain in his bed, lying there, painful and moaning. That's what she said.
Your Honor, I move for admission of, I believe it's, first of all, the Via Christi records, which are exhibit number 3, if I'm not mistaken. Second. Exhibit number 4. Move for admission.
Your Honor, we do not have an objection to the introduction of the majority of the Via Christi records. There are some portions of the records that need to be redacted for the basis they include inadmissible hearsay. I have a copy with redactions that can be substituted. I don't have an objection to using those portions of the exhibit for examination until the redacted portions can be substituted. But otherwise, we don't have any objections other than the hearsay objections that have been raised.
Is there any objection to that procedure?
Yes.
Okay.
First
then
of all,
will counsel
one...
approach?
What?
Will counsel approach?
Yes, Your Honor, just one second. I'm looking for that.
Chapa? That would be a great time to do this, so why don't you take a recess and we will come look for you at around 11 o'clock after we take up these matters. Thank you for raising that.
All rise.
All right. Mr. Feiger, you can continue.
Okay, so
Again, members of the jury, I'm sorry for that delay. I know it was a lot longer than what we told you.
Our exhibit, Sedgwick,
Via Christi?
the Regional Forensic Science Center report, is that in, Your Honor? Subject to what you ruled?
Right, it will be received as redacted.
Right, and the Via Christi medical records, are those in, subject to what you ruled?
Exhibit 4 is the only one you've offered.
Right. So I move for 1 and 4.
Subject to what I've already ruled, I assume you have no objection?
No, that's subject to what you've already ruled, no objection. I do need to make sure that we're talking about the same one. I know the plaintiff had a 1A. We're not trying to offer that now, are we? Mr. Feiger, or are we just offering one as it was originally marked?
No, one is the entire report, including photographs.
No. Yeah, there are some objections to some photographs that weren't produced, Your Honor.
What do you mean that weren't produced?
Were not exchanged.
That weren't exchanged. He just gave them to me.
All right, counsel, if I'm looking at some autopsy photographs and I don't see any reason for those to go in. So, subject to that, is there any objection to the report going in as redacted as I already ruled?
No, Your Honor.
Exhibit 1 is received as consistent with that ruling.
May we approach the bench, please?
Yes.
Good morning again, Dr. Spitz.
Good morning.
By 7 a.m. on the 10th, would the fact that Mr. Bruner was suffering from a sickness be obvious to anybody?
Objections beyond the scope of the report.
What was the date you said?
The 10th. March the 10th.
Objection is overruled.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I didn't.
By 7 a.m. on March the 10th, would it be obvious to anyone that Mr. Bruner was suffering from sickness? You've just ruled, Your Honor.
Overruled.
No, there would not be any. I cannot see anyone looking at Mr. Bruner at that time that you indicated who would not recognize that he's severely ill.
In terms of the sickness that he was suffering from, Your Honor, I move for admission of proposed Exhibit 5, investigation of the Sedgwick County Sheriff's Department.
Your Honor, as to 5, there were a number of objections. It's a package of materials, and it includes some of the records, as I recall, that we've already talked about from St. Francis. I really don't have objections to those records, which are, in fact, the Sheriff's Department's investigative reports. It's the additional records that I think are cumulative and are tied into some of the objections.
No, I'm just referring to the records as part of the report. I'm not referring to his additional records that he previously made an objection to,
Right,
that are
then-
contained within that report.
What are the page numbers? Is it,
It's not paginated to my knowledge.
my copy starts with page 33.
Correct. Bait stamp 33 through, I believe, 47, Your Honor.
So there's no objection as to those?
If you give me a second, Your Honor, I can tell you the ones I object to. And I think it's been listed in previous papers somewhere, but there's a Bates number, it's hard to read, 135.
Okay, he's not offering that.
I'm not offering that. You're right, Your Honor. It's just the bait stamps that the court just indicated.
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed the first. That's from 33 to what?
Just
47.
47. Correct, Your Honor?
Mm-hmm.
Your Honor, I do not have any objections to 33 through 47, inclusive of 47.
Received.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. I'll show you a record. It's just been admitted, Doctor, from the Sedgwick Sheriff's Office. Deputy Jones, referring to the 10th of March, 2008. Without reading, I'll just read one paragraph to you out loud. Perhaps it'd be easier, Your Honor. I think I could use the Elmo here, and then it's easier for all the court and the Can you see that on your Elmo, sir?
Yes.
Okay. At approximately 1700 hours, Nurse Tony was bringing inmate Brewer. This is timed 2140. What is that military time, sir?
9:40
9:40 on
p.m.
On the 10th of March. At approximately 1700 hours, Nurse Tony was bringing inmate Bruner, Tera, back to the housing area. At this time, I was unaware who this inmate was and why he was being housed.
What page are we talking about?
Well, it's mixed. It says at the bottom, page 76, but it's actually mispaginated. It's within that document, page 44, and
Can you just tell me what?
Well,
76.
Your Honor, I don't have any objection to including 76 in the exhibits, but now I've got some concerns. There are other, I don't know what, at this point, Plaintiff's Exhibit 5 is. They've seemed to offer part of it, now they're offering another part.
My copy of pages 33 through 47 doesn't have a page 76 that I can see.
Well, I think it does, Your Honor, if you're going to have to go through it.
I just did. Where is it?
It's not paginated in order. Do you understand? The Bates stamps don't.
And mine is 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47. So I don't know what you're looking at.
I'll find the page then.
Your Honor, if we'll expedite matters, I don't have objection to introduction of Plaintiff's Exhibit 5, with the exception of the last five pages. No, I didn't care about the last 3 pages, which I think are duplicative of.
I withdraw, excuse me, I withdraw that. It's Exhibit 2. It's not 5, I apologize. It's Exhibit 2, which contains Exhibit 5 within it.
Well, Is Exhibit 2 in evidence?
I move for Exhibit 2. It contains Exhibit 5, the same thing, it's duplicative. Do you have Exhibit 5?
What is Exhibit 2?
Sedgwick County Jail detention records and logs.
Any objection?
Well, I'm at this point a little concerned that I'm looking at the same Exhibit 2, Your Honor. Maybe if I could look at the original, I have my copy of it, I don't have an objection. But I'm fearful as to what it is that the plaintiff now has marked as Exhibit 2.
I'm not...
Yeah, unless this comes in through stipulation, this is really not the appropriate way to introduce the Sedgwick County records. This gentleman is not in a position to lay a foundation for them.
But is he objecting to his own records, Judge? He didn't object to these.
Well, he's saying he needs more time, and so I'm trying to think of a way to expedite this.
Well, we're at trial, Judge, and he can't possibly be objecting now to his own records. He's had these records.
I don't think that's what he's saying. I think he's saying he wants to verify that the copy you're using is the one that he's using.
I don't object to plaintiff's Exhibit 2 as it was produced to me. We can assume, and we have counsel's representation, that this is not one that they've changed, and I don't have any objection.
It's not.
It's not what?
So 2 and 5 would be admitted?
Wait, it's not what? It's not one you've changed?
No, I haven't changed anything, Your Honor.
Okay, Exhibit 2 is received.
And Exhibit 5 I move for.
I already received Exhibit, pages 33 through 47 of Exhibit 5.
Seems to me that my Exhibit 5 that I have marked is more inclusive than those pages. It's larger.
Right.
What? The exhibit that I have, Exhibit 5, is more than those pages that you're referring to.
Right, so
I
are
want
you
the
offering
whole
the
Exhibit
rest?
5 in.
Okay. Any objection?
Well, I think I tried to make my objection to 5 before, Your Honor, and that is just to the last 4 pages, which are duplicative of Exhibit 1 and are subject to the same objections there, I believe. I have to tell you that I think 5 is duplicative of 2, but I don't have any objection.
The court receives pages 33 through 134 of Exhibit 5.
Thank you.
As to the last 4 pages, you'll have to establish, offer that separately.
I understand. Just give that to Bob. This is written 2140 at 1500 hours.
Again, counsel, can you tell me what you're referring to?
Page 76, written by Deputy Jones.
Page 76 of what exhibit?
I believe this is exhibit number...
I think it's 2, Your Honor.
2.
All right, go ahead.
At approximately 1700 hours, Nurse Tony was bringing inmate Bruner, Terry, back to the housing area. At this time, I was unaware of who this inmate was and why he was being housed. I was informed by the clinic staff that this inmate needed to be in a hospital bed and to be in a room viewable by clinic staff. I had Trustee Rodamel assist me in moving the hospital bed into cell 202 with clinic inmate Collins John. After getting the bed up, I had the above-named trustee go to the bedrolls for the clinic since there were none. I left Nurse Tony with inmate Bruner and continued my duties. Later, when the trustee returned with 4 bedrolls, the bed was made. Nurse Sharon and I lifted inmate Bruner out of the wheelchair into the bed. He was wearing a safety restraint vest while in the wheelchair. Nurse Sharon took his vital signs. He didn't want to keep his arm in place, and he kept trying to sit up, so I had to keep putting my hand on his shoulder to keep him down. The inmate appeared to be in pain. His eyes were crusty from maybe dry discharge. He was moaning and didn't look well. My first question to you is, what's the crustiness refer to in terms of the condition that you indicated to the court and jury he was suffering from? What's the crustiness?
You asking me?
Yes.
The crustiness is when there's sepsis in progress. Many times the lining of the eyelids also get inflamed and ooze a secretion. And when that crusts, that's what you see here.
Okay. It says here he didn't want to keep his arm in place, and he kept trying to sit up, so I had to keep putting my hand on his shoulder to keep him down. In terms of the meningitis, how is that symptom, or is that a volitional? Does he have the ability at this time to make those decisions, or what's going on in terms of him?
No, that's an involuntary movement to breathe more easily, because there are fluids that accumulate in the lung, and when the patient lies down, the fluids spread throughout the lung. When the patient sits up, the fluids go to the bottom, and then there's more breathing space above. When pneumonia is very widespread throughout the lung, it is like an asphyxiation, because there's not enough air going through the lung, because the space is occupied by debris of inflammatory products.
Now, in terms of what he was suffering from, Doctor, we have pictures and evidence from exhibit number 1. I'll show that to you. And ask you if you can help us understand what we're looking at and whether that's consistent with your opinion about meningitis.
Yes, it does. You can see the pus. Inflammation, certain types of inflammation cause pus. And what you are seeing, those whitish gray or greenish, little greenish yellowish areas, this is, by the way, the brain upside down. You are looking at the brain from below. And the type of bacteria that I've indicated earlier, the Streptococcus pneumoniae, tends to go to the bottom of the brain, more so than other places. And what you are looking at, all these light-colored areas are pus.
Is there swelling in that brain also?
There is a lot of swelling in the brain. The reason I know that is because the brain is a large organ in a small space. So in order for the space within the skull to accommodate the brain bunches up like a handkerchief. I will show you. Big handkerchief, small handkerchief in the skull, between my two hands. When the brain swells, it takes up a lot of space, and then all these individual areas, like I'm showing you in my handkerchief, They are close together, and they cause the brain to look like a solid organ, which it is not. And you do not see any spaces here between these individual places. You see it's all like compressed brain. That's what you're looking at.
What literally, why, and I want to show you as just a exemplar. Is this a picture, Doctor, of a normal brain?
This is a side view of a normal brain, yes.
Counsel, can I ask a question? The parties have stipulated that Mr. Bruner, as of 7 a.m. on March 10, 2008, was suffering from a serious illness and that he had symptoms which caused him to develop meningitis, from which he ultimately died. Why are we going into all of this? Is there any issue about what these defendants weren't aware of these pictures or the condition of Mr. Bruner's brain?
Well, this assists the jury in understanding the pain and suffering during the period of time that
All right, well, let's move along to that area then.
why the difference? Why do we see? Why is the brain recede?
Because when the brain swells, it gets compressed. You see the difference? It's like a solid mass. It's not individual areas. There are spaces there in that brain on the black and white below. The brain on the picture, on the bottom picture, is seen from the side. That's why it looks a little different. But in addition to that, you see the spaces between those areas called convolutions, which are those areas that I showed you in my handkerchief that are also compressed that they look like one organ, like one mass.
I have a model too. Would this assist you in explaining to the court and jury what you indicated was the herniation?
Well, when there is herniation, when the brain fits into this space, and this space, so that when this sits on top of that, all this area is full of brain. And when the brain swells, there is, first of all, a membrane over the brain called the dura, which is a very tough membrane, and it follows the contour of the brain. And when the brain swells, the brain swells towards the dura, and the dura doesn't budge because it is fixed to the bone. And so then the brain starts going down, and it goes down into this hole. And into this hole, in this hole, like my finger now, or maybe two fingers, is the brainstem that connects to the spinal cord. And the brain, the bottom part of the brain, that little part that is on the left side, will be sucked into this hole and compress that area specifically, which contains the breathing center and the heart regulatory center. And it compresses it. I'm sorry, Your Honor. I didn't hear. The breathing center and the heart regulatory center. The heart beats, the center that controls the heartbeat. And because that brain, that little part there, gets like as if sucked into this space, it's already, my finger is already crammed in here. Not very much, but it is somewhat because the spinal cord is a little bigger. So then the brain goes in here and it compresses the uppermost spinal cord, which is where those centers are situated.
Is that ultimately which caused his death? I mean,
That is ultimately what caused his death.
In all, based on your review of these records, how long did this process from beginning to end take?
This process develops over a lengthy period of time. From starting, climbing up the mountain, gradually, very slowly, little more every day. Then it stays at the top for a while, still not compressing sufficiently. And then when it starts to compress sufficiently, will get all kinds of haywire rhythms, and eventually he will get what is called ventricular fibrillation, and he will die.
In terms of this case,
That only portion, that ventricular fibrillation, is a very sudden and very acute process, and it doesn't take very long to kill a person because their heart just goes haywire. But up until then, there are other manifestations, less severe, less acute, and those cause different kinds of breathing and different kinds of heartbeat.
Getting beyond the question.
that's fine, I agree. Let me ask you the next question. In terms of your review of these records, in terms of the process, how many days did you believe?
Several days, 2 or 3 days, 4 days maybe.
Was it going on the 10th, the last day?
Of course it was going on the 10th.
Have you reviewed this record from the Staton County? This is Exhibit 2, Bates stamp number 54.
Yes, I did.
Okay. Let's take a look at the first entry into that. This is from Staton County, from Sedgwick County Jail. Exhibit 2, I said Staton County, and the record will reflect I made a mistake. The first entry is on 3/5/08 at 8:15. That's 5 days before the 10th. PE, or PC, I can't read that,
PC, phone call.
from Carol Shepard at Staton County, I won't read the number, states, inmate, I am weak, not eating meals times 2 days, blood in the stool. Notified Ted Gibson will return to Sedgwick County Adult Detention Facility. What's the significance of that, Doctor?
Your Honor, I don't think that's a proper question. Who knows what he'll say in response to that? It's an open-ended opinion question that
I'll restate it. In terms of your opinion about the progression of meningitis in this case, what's the significance of that, Doctor?
That this individual already now at this point shows evidence of disease. He showed that he's not eating because he doesn't feel like he wants to eat. Like a patient in an acute illness often doesn't eat. This individual, this person, also did not eat because he didn't feel like eating. And in addition to that, he had also got blood in the stool.
By the way, is decreased appetite consistent with
Decreased desire to eat. In other words, decreased appetite.
Is that consistent with the disease process?
It's consistent with a significant disease because little diseases don't interfere very much with appetite.
The next entry in the medical records at Sedgwick is on 3/10/08. Is there any indication that this process somehow stopped between 3/5 and 3/10?
No, it didn't stop. It went on.
Says that
The contrary, it did the contrary of stopping.
untimed entry, inmate arrived in clinic unalert, unresponsive to painful stimuli.
Yeah, that
What's-
means he had, what the doctors do here is cause either with a needle, push on the sole of his foot, or they pinch his skin, and he would normally, a person would react by pulling his foot back. But when a person does not pull his foot back, that means that he is already in an advanced state of the disease where the sensitivity to painful stimuli has disappeared. And that is one of the last things that will disappear.
Abdomen distended and firm, unable to ambulate. What does that mean?
That means he cannot walk.
What's the abdomen distended and firm? What's the
The
significance of
abdomen
that?
is big and firm. He has fluid in the abdomen from his liver cirrhosis, which was not addressed and therefore accumulated. And he, the abdomen, as a result of that, becomes like a drum because there's fluid in there and the skin is draped over the fluid.
On autopsy, was there an explanation of the abdomen?
Yes, there was 2,700 ml of fluid in the abdominal cavity
From what?
from his liver cirrhosis, which causes the blood below the liver to go stagnant because it does not circulate through the liver, because the liver has abundant scarring, and blood that does not circulate, blood that does not move, segregates red blood cells from fluid. And the fluid is what accumulates, the fluid is able to come out of the blood vessels and go into the abdominal cavity. And there it accumulates.
Counsel, can we keep this focused on what symptoms might have been visible?
Yes. What symptoms might have been visible?
Well, first of all,
Or would have been visible on the 10th?
First of all, the girth is large. The abdomen is big because 2,700 ml is a lot of fluid. That is 27 ml is it's like 4 bottles of 750 ml of vodka.
What would that?
Whatever, water. 750 ml times 4 would be 2,800.
Would that have been visible on the 10th
That would be visible.
to anybody coming
Visible.
in contact
And
with him?
I'm sorry?
To anyone coming in contact with him?
Well,
Calls
yes.
for speculation, Your Honor, beyond the scope of the report.
Would it be visible?
Of course it would be visible. It would be like a mountain in the middle.
Thank you. This is Bait Stamp 66 from Exhibit, again, Your Honor, the statement from defendant Staton on the 10th. On 3/10/2008, I, Deputy Staton, was assigned to Pod 1. At approximately 7:15, deputies were coming into the pod for a linen exchange. As we was doing Section C, I let down all of the stairs inmates out. Inmate Bruner came out of his cell without linen. He walked over to the bookshelf under the stairs. I bang on the window to get inmate Brewer attention. Inmates was coming back into the section from the gym. Some of the inmates said to inmate Brewer to get his linen for linen exchange. Inmate Brewer went to his cell. I hit the stitch to open his door a couple times. He opened his door, then shut it. He did this a couple times and was not going into his cell. I called into the gym and asked some deputies to come and help inmate Bruner into his cell. Deputy Murphy and Deputy Jameson came to Section C and helped inmate Brewer into his cell. Inmate Brewer went in with no problems. I left inmate Brewer in his cell for the morning. Inmate Brat Snyder came to the booth and told me that Bruner was not eating any of the food since he came into the pod. And I want you to assume that's since the 7th or 6th. I looked up when inmate Bruner came into the pod. He came in 3/6, from out of county. Now, just dealing with that paragraph, what's the significance of those symptoms observed by the defendant, Staton, by her visibly?
Well, he is confused. He's more than confused. He is not rational. He doesn't use his brain to think. He cannot use his brain to think.
Why not?
Well, because he is...
Is this process going on at that time?
This is going on. There is a degree of brain swelling, less than that, because let's not forget this is the end product.
This didn't happen in 1 second, did it?
This didn't happen.
I'm referring it for the record to the brain.
This did not happen in 1 second. This is meningitis, brain swelling, herniation, everything combined.
Was this process...
The end product at the autopsy.
Could this process have been stopped if somebody got medical care and got him antibiotics?
Antibiotics and steroids to reduce the brain swelling.
And would he have survived then?
He would have survived.
Continuing, at approximately 10:25...
Every chance that he would have survived.
Okay. Approximately 10:25, Sergeant Martinez came into the pod, and I told him, I assume a able inmate Bruner, how he was at linen exchange and not eating. Sergeant Martinez said to get a hold of mental health to see him. I called and talked to Andrea, and she said she'll come down and see him in the afternoon. Approximately 11:50, Chow came into the pod. The pod worker for Section C, inmate Bramadelli, also told me that inmate Brewer was not eating. I asked him to take a tray to inmate Brewer's cell. When everyone was done eating, I had inmate Obagani go and get the tray from inmate Bruner's cell and show me. Inmate Brewer did not touch anything on the tray. I logged in that he did not eat. What's the significance of that symptom?
The not eating is not a cause of death. The not eating is a result, not a cause. The not eating is a result of loss of appetite, loss of ability to keep food down, it is a result of a slowing down of stomach function. The food accumulates in the stomach remains full, and he cannot eat, and he doesn't want to eat.
Would this
Stomach response, desire to eat, hunger, in other words, from not eating is a result of an empty stomach. His stomach is not empty because the food that he ate 2 days ago or 3 days ago is still in there.
Would someone who's suffering from the diseases that you have testified you believe him suffering, and based on the descriptions that you're reading here by the defendant, appear to be ill?
Objection, again, Your Honor, is beyond the scope, or beyond the report, rather.
What would one notice about his appearance, his deterioration?
He appears ill, gaunt. He appears gaunt. He appears ill. I don't know how to tell you that. Maybe sunken eyes would be the crusts in the eyes. He appears ill. He's, in addition to that, he is somewhat yellowish too. He is delusional. He doesn't think right. He sees things that aren't there. So it's little wonder that that is associated with brain swelling.
Approximately 1,400, I had inmates in Section C come up to the booth and say that inmate Brewer is on the floor and not moving. I called for Rover 1 South to come to the pod. Rover 1 South Deputy Jameson came in, and I had him check on inmate Bruner. Deputy Jameson went in and helped inmate Bruner to his bed. Deputy Jameson came into the booth and said, inmate Bruner's not doing good. I called for Sergeant Martinez. He asked if mental health saw inmate Bruner. I told him they had not come down yet. He will call. He said that he will call. What's going on there now? We're now at 2 o'clock.
I do not think that he fell. I do not think that he collapsed. He just went down because maybe he was delusional. We know that, and he probably went down on the floor because that's where. When he couldn't find his bed, he went down on the floor because he couldn't stand up.
And how is that consistent with the illnesses that you said he was suffering at that time?
Well, he has no energy. He has no ability to walk around and look for his bed. He probably was able to see the bed but didn't understand what it was.
Defendants acknowledge he was in need of medical care. Was he?
All of that is one picture.
Defendant Jameson wrote a report concerning that day. On 3/10, I was assigned to Rover South on the first shift at approximately 7:40 hours after we had just...
What page are you referring to and what
I'm sorry,
exhibit?
Your Honor. Exhibits number 2, page 68. Thank you, Your Honor. On 3/10/2008, I was assigned to Rover 1 South on the first shift. At approximately 7:40 hours after we had just completed linen exchange in Pod 1, I was asked by Deputy Staton to put an inmate back in his cell. So myself, along with Deputy Murphy, went over to inmate Bruner, Terry A., and helped him walk over to his cell 124. Inmate Bruner was acting very strange and moving extremely slow, but was complying with the orders that were given to him. What's the significance of that in terms of your opinion?
That tells you what I just told you. He was complying with the orders. Some of it he realized in the little bit that was there left to be realized, to enable him to function with that brain that was under pressure, and some of it was not.
Well, what if somebody said, just hypothetically, well, he didn't ask me for help? What's your response to that?
He is severely...
Wait. I mean, now we're well beyond the report, Your Honor, and we're also speculating on somebody else's testimony that would be appropriate subject for this witness to testify on any.
An hypothetical is entirely appropriate for an expert witness. I'm not asking him to speculate. And he has testified and written in his report that he was obtunded, which means unable to form comprehensive thought, Your Honor.
Why don't you rephrase your question?
Okay. In terms of your opinions regarding the effect on the brain, would he be able to ask for help?
He would not be able to ask because he's not able to enunciate and talk. And all he wants is to lie down and rest in a place that is that enables him to lie down, whether it's the floor or his bed.
At approximately 1400 hours, 2 o'clock, I was called back to the pod to check on the welfare of inmate Bruner. Upon entering cell 124, I noticed inmate Bruner was lying on the floor in a pile of trash, curled up in the fetal position. I picked the inmate up and placed him on his bed and secured the cell door. What's the significance of that, lying on the floor in trash at 2 o'clock?
That is the illustration of what I just told you. He does not know, nor does he care about whether there is trash. He lies down where he is standing. He needs to lie down because he doesn't have the energy to stand up.
If he had gotten medical care as late as 2 o'clock, could he survive?
He would have had a lot less brain swelling. Energetic treatment might well have taken care of the underlying problem.
Your Honor, I don't think that was expressed as a medical certainty.
Within a reasonable degree of medical I'll re-ask the question. Thank you, Your Honor, if I may. Within a reasonable degree of medical certainty, would he have survived if he had received care by that time?
Energetic care, concentrated, the right kind of care, yes.
In a hospital?
In a hospital, of course.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions at this time, Your Honor.
All right. Why don't we take, are you all hungry? You ready for recess, or you want to go till 1? Okay, I'm seeing some people for 1, so let's resume cross-examination, or let's start cross-examination right now. Mr. Chalmers?
Morning. I guess it's afternoon now, isn't it? Mr. or Dr. Spitz, you've testified on a number of different occasions before. I think you told that to counsel. Is that right?
You mean in this case or in general?
Generally.
Yes, I've testified many times.
You're a frequent testifier in legal matters. Is that right?
Yes, you could say that.
And over the last 10 years, your work has all been medical legal, hasn't it? Working and being paid for by doctors, or excuse me, by lawyers.
My medical legal career has now gone into its 58th year.
Yeah, but over the last 10 years, all of your work has been in the medical legal work.
Has always been, from the start. At one point at the beginning of the 58 years, I was in training, and then once I was trained, I
exclusively, sir, what you do...
done nothing other than forensic pathology.
Exclusively, sir, what you do is medical legal work and have done so for the last 10 years.
Yeah, but not only the last 10 years. I've always done it from very inception.
Okay, and I understand that. You've also been a pathologist in the past.
Yeah, but not in a hospital. I worked in a hospital part-time at one time for a 2-year duration. But all of my work, my professional work, has been in one shape or another forensic pathology.
Now, you, as part of your practice, before you got into the medical legal work exclusively, it never involved treating patients, did it?
No, I've never treated patients.
Never treated patients with cirrhosis?
No.
With meningitis?
No.
With bacterial meningitis?
No.
You're not an expert in liver transplants, are you?
No.
And you can't say who would be a candidate for a liver transplant and who wouldn't be a candidate for a liver transplant, can
No,
you?
I don't determine when a liver transplant is to be obtained or not to be obtained.
You're not an infectious disease doctor?
No.
Never have been?
Never have been.
Not a gastroenterologist, are you?
No. I'm a forensic pathologist.
Now, you've worked with Mr. Feiger's firm before, haven't you?
I worked with what?
You've worked with Mr. Feiger's firm before, haven't you? In fact, you've probably worked with him on as many as 100 previous occasions, haven't you?
I don't know. I don't know. I've worked for Mr. Feiger upon his or his office's request, and I've also worked on the other side of Mr. Feiger.
Well, the fact is you've worked with Mr. Feiger's firm maybe more than 100 times, isn't that correct?
I never counted it. I don't know.
You're not conceding that that's possible?
It may, it's possible, yes.
And you're not conceding that it's likely?
I'm not conceding what?
It is likely that you've worked with his firm on more than 100 occasions, isn't it?
That it's logical? Is that what
Likely. It is likely that you
Oh,
worked.
likely. Yes, it may be.
And Mr. Feiger, he represents civil plaintiffs, is that right?
Mostly, but I've testified for Mr. Feiger in other cases as well.
Criminal defense cases.
Criminal cases, yes.
And you've testified, I think you indicated, in some pretty high-profile cases. You had some involvement, what did you say, Mr. Feiger, in the O.J. Simpson case?
I don't think that I've had any of the high-profile cases.
Well, how about the was it Renee Anthony case?
That has nothing to do with Mr. Feiger.
Oh, I didn't mean to suggest that it was. If that was why I asked my question, I apologize. You have testified in some high-profile cases, regardless of whoever the counsel are.
Yes, I've testified in high-profile.
And most recently was the mother who was accused of killing her little girl down in Florida.
Yes.
And you charge for your time,
Yes.
and you are being paid, what, in excess of $5,000 for your day's time, is that right?
For a day of testimony, yes.
Now, someone can have confusion, and there can be lots of different causes for confusion, can't there?
Yes.
Dehydration is one cause.
Yes.
And you talked about a series of symptoms with Mr. Feiger that included blood in the stool, inability to walk, confusion, and some others. And those were all symptoms that built together painted a story to you that here was a man who was ultimately suffering from bacterial meningitis. Is that a fair statement?
No.
You're a medical doctor. Is that correct?
Yes.
You look at things as a medical doctor, don't you?
Yes.
You look at things as a forensic pathologist, looking back on your experience and everything that you've done as a doctor in that field when you analyze things, don't you?
Yes.
And as you analyze this case, your conclusion was that every physician or someone or somebody with medical knowledge can be a nurse, can be a physician's assistant, could be a nurse practitioner, could be a whole bunch of people. They would independently deploy their thinking mechanisms and say, this man needs help, not in an hour, but now. That was your conclusion, wasn't it?
You know, there's something wrong with the instrumentation that...
Let me see if I can repeat it. I see you're struggling to hear me. Is that better?
I think it is.
All right.
Try that if you don't
I'll
mind.
try, and I'll speak up a little bit. And
Thank you very much.
thank you. And what I was trying to get at is it's been your opinion that based on the symptoms that you described and the information that you had available, that every physician or somebody with medical knowledge, that can be a nurse, that can be a physician assistant, that can be a nurse practitioner, that can be a whole bunch of people, would then, if they would independently deploy their thinking and say, this man needs help, not in an hour, but now. That was your opinion back when your deposition was taken, wasn't it?
That's correct. That's my opinion today as well.
Mr. Bruner had a long-standing history of alcoholic liver disease, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, when you have reviewed cases of meningitis and analyzed their symptoms, you've done it in the context of either as a medical student years ago, or through your work as a pathologist, is that right?
As a forensic pathologist, yes.
And certainly all your recent knowledge then that you can rely on to describe the progression of the meningitis disease and the like, that comes from your work as a forensic pathologist, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now that kind of means by definition that you are reviewing only those cases where the patient came in and died, isn't that right?
No.
Are you saying that you've reviewed individuals who have died of other causes but survived meningitis?
You know, I cannot really tell you, as I sit here now, what all the cases of
Sure.
meningitis were due to or what they were associated with over my career as a forensic pathologist.
Fair enough.
I have certain cases in mind that I remember because I was involved with them more so than with other cases. For instance, I know of a case where a woman had a tooth extracted and something happened at the base of the skull and a little fracture was, and bacteria from the mouth went into the skull and caused meningitis.
And she died.
And she died. She was found dead in bed a week after the tooth extraction. I have done autopsies on young people kids in school who went home with a headache and a few days later were found to have meningitis.
And they died.
And they died. Sometimes they did not die, because I've had cases that were brought to me for consultation where I had to study the medical records in order to put it all together. As I said earlier today, when I get a case for autopsy, I will check if there was a medical record, and if there was one, I want to see it. And that's what I did in this case.
Can we agree that in those rare instances, can we agree that in those instances where you have reviewed a patient's record concerning meningitis, those, I got stumbling on my question. Can we agree that those cases in which you have reviewed a patient who contracted meningitis are rare?
Meningitis is not a very common condition, but meningitis is also at the same time, not a very infrequent condition. From time to time, you see meningitis.
Yeah, you may be misunderstanding my question, and I'll try to rephrase it. Your experience, doctor, not the medical world.
Yeah, that is my experience.
Your experience has been only in the rarest of cases have you looked at a patient who had meningitis and did not die.
Rarely, yes, because most of my patients are deceased. That's correct.
Exactly. Now, the woman that you mentioned, the one who came to the hospital who died 3 days later, did they know when she got in the hospital that she had meningitis?
They could have known very easily then meningitis is not a difficult condition to diagnose in a patient who goes to the hospital or who is in the hospital. All it involves is an easily performed spinal tap. And you can culture it, you can know the bug, you can determine what antibiotic it's sensitive to. You can make a diagnosis of meningitis within a matter of minutes.
But they didn't figure it out, did they?
She never went to the hospital. This individual never went to the hospital until it was too late.
Well, I thought maybe the example you gave was a woman that went to the hospital
So that was a
who
special
had a headache and then died 3 days later from meningitis.
Yes.
All right. So there was an instance where she went to the hospital and they didn't figure it out.
You know, it is unfair of you to ask me details about a case that I probably was involved with years ago.
I don't mean to. I don't mean to be.
I cannot comment on that.
And
I just don't remember.
And I apologize. The reason I mention it is it was in your deposition transcript. You used it as an example.
I know. I remember certain aspects of a case because you asked me about meningitis. But to say that I can now discuss that case, I think that's exaggerated. I cannot.
Fair enough. So we're left with your discussion in the deposition, which was that this was a woman who went to the hospital, that the doctors didn't understand it was meningitis, and 3 days later she died. Is
Well,
that
maybe
correct?
there were other extenuating circumstances that I cannot discuss now.
Now, if almost all the cases in which you've been involved involve someone who's died from meningitis, can we infer that it may be hard for the individual or for healthcare providers to diagnose the meningitis in time to get treatment?
You know, when somebody, as a physician, I can only say this, that when somebody comes into the hospital, that somebody is going to be looked over with a fine-tooth comb to find out what's wrong with them, and then to associate those findings with the history of what hurts the patient, what transpired, in other words. And if somebody comes into the hospital with a history of headache and nothing else, the first thing I think that most any logical physician is going to think of is, why don't we do a spinal tap and check that out? And since it is an easy procedure and almost non-invasive, I mean, you put a needle into the bottom part of the back and go into a sac where there's no cord, and you suck up a bit of spinal fluid, and you give it to the technician. They stain it, centrifuge it, stain it, and the pathologist or the clinician, for that matter, looks in a microscope and makes a diagnosis.
Thank you for that answer. But let's get back to your experience, which is that except in rare cases, every case where you have followed a patient that has meningitis, they have died, and that indicates, doesn't it, that figuring out that it is an emergency situation isn't that simple.
You're talking about in general, or you're talking about this case?
I'm talking about in general.
The people that I have mostly seen are deceased. And I can, at the time of autopsy, I don't yet have the medical records. I cannot wait with an autopsy because the family will not appreciate if I say, well, I now need to get the medical records and I'll do this autopsy in a week. They're not going to like that. So I do the autopsy when I get the body. At that time, I know little about the background other than what the police will tell me about how the body was found. So if the person comes from a hospital, I get medical records, but if the person comes from home, I may have nothing. So at that time, I know nothing other than what may be a relative, if there is one, can tell me what mom complained of a headache or mom did not complain of a headache. I do an autopsy and I find pus over the brain, everything is answered. Now I get the medical records a week later or 2 weeks later, and then I put it all together about what brought this on. The diagnosis I already know.
And again, I appreciate the answer. I'm not sure it's the answer to the question I asked, so I'll take one more shot at it. And it's probably my question that's the problem. The fact is, sir, in your experience, except in rare cases, the individual with meningitis with whom you come in contact, somebody blew it and didn't figure out they had meningitis to get it treated timely. Isn't that true?
Many people don't go to the doctor. They think they take Tylenol or something and it'll get better.
They think they've got a cold.
They don't go to the hospital. No, they don't think they have a cold.
They think they have the
flu. I don't know what they think. I don't know what they think. It's not material to me what they think. What they think is of no consequence. But the fact is, when I get the body from somebody who was found dead at home, chances are that they probably took some drug to hopefully alleviate the pain. Maybe they don't even have insurance to go to the hospital. That happens, unfortunately, too.
Are you suggesting that in the cases where you've seen people die of meningitis, it's because they've gotten some sort of illegal drug to self-medicate?
No, I don't suggest that.
Are you suggesting in all those cases you have people who've realized, hey, look, I've got a severe medical condition, but I don't want to go to the emergency room because it might cost me some money?
Because it costs a lot of money. For some people, what most people think is a little money or not that much money, some people just don't have it.
Fair enough. So it's been your experience that people suffering from this severe meningitis will make a decision that their symptoms are such that they don't want to go to the hospital because they don't think they can afford it.
Or take another situation where they go to sleep at night thinking that the headache is going to go away, or maybe during the daytime, and they never wake up.
You can sleep through this, can you?
That can be too. I mean, there's all kind of possibilities, but none of this corresponds to the case at hand.
Now, Mr. Bruner was immunosuppressed and more susceptible to infection because of his liver condition, is that right?
That's correct.
And that liver condition you indicated was there for a long period of time, wasn't it?
Yes.
Your opinion is that when Mr. Bruner, or excuse me, your opinion was that Mr. Bruner, if he had been provided with antibiotics on 3/10, it's March 10, 2008, that he could have survived.
Yes.
And in your deposition, you thought that if he had been provided antibiotics 6 hours earlier on March 10, that he would have likely survived.
I think so, yes.
You stand by that? 7 hours probably would have passed away, 6 would have been fine.
I stand by that.
Now, excuse me, Your Honor. Defendants would offer Defendant's Exhibit 403 at this time, Your Honor. It may be already included in evidence in another exhibit, but plaintiff had not objected to it.
Is that right?
.403.
Received.
Exhibit 403 is it's a log that's kept at the jail, timeline for the inmate, and in particular for Mr. Bruner. And it shows that at 3:27, a little bit after that Mr. Bruner was moved from detention cell from detention pod 001, cell 124A, to a temporary location, the clinic in the jail. And you understood that to mean that Mr. Bruner first started to get some medical help at 3:27, 27. At 3:27 is when he was moved, according to this particular log. You understand that?
I don't see 327 on this chart.
It actually says 15:27:12. If I put my finger on it, maybe that'll help. See it? That's military time, and you understand that to be 3:27
Yes.
in the afternoon.
I see it.
Okay.
Yeah, moved from cell location and what 001 124A to temporary location.
And I'd like to also move for the admission of Defendant's Exhibit 407, to which there was no objection, Your Honor.
Any objection?
That's the daily activity log.
Received.
Now, in the daily activity log, there's a record where it shows Deputy Hunt in pod for transport to clinic, inmate Bruner, 24 down, at 3:21. You see what I'm referring to? It's right here. Doctor, do you see what I'm referring to?
I'm sorry?
You see what I'm referring to where it says at 3:21? Okay. Then there's the record that we have as to when he got to the hospital. Plaintiff's Exhibit 4, the first page, Your Honor, indicates that, and this is one of the documents that you reviewed as part of your opinions, the records from Via Christi St. Francis Medical Center. Is that right?
Yes.
And it shows an admission at 21:53. That's what, 9:53 in the evening?
Almost 10 o'clock, yes.
Okay. So we know that it took somewhere between about, about 3:27 to almost 10 o'clock for the medical people at the clinic in the jail to determine and to get Mr. Bruner transported for treatment for his medical condition. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Okay, and that works out to, if I did my math right, about 6.5 hours for these medical people to decide he had a condition that needed to be treated at a hospital, right?
Yes.
Now let's be clear about this. You can't treat someone with a meningitis in the condition that Mr. Bruner had it unless you've got the sort of antibiotics available at the hospital.
I cannot
Well,
really...
as a practical matter, it's your opinion that if he
The
didn't...
meningitis that Mr. Bruner had would probably respond to the usual type of antibiotics. He was like ampicillin, like I don't know what I'm not a treating physician.
I understand. I understand. There are lots of medications he probably needed, and you're not familiar exactly with what those are.
I don't treat people, but my knowledge goes to the point that meningitis responds to treatment if appropriately delivered and appropriate antibiotics are used.
And here, that treatment to be appropriately delivered had to be at the hospital, didn't it?
Well, hospitals have antibiotics.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
I say hospitals are supposed to have antibiotics.
Okay.
I don't know whether it had that particular antibiotic or not, but if it didn't, it should have.
So we've got about a 6.5 hour lag between when it gets to the clinic medical staff and before Mr. Bruner has his first opportunity to survive because he has to be at the hospital, right?
Yes.
So let's work backwards. I think if we start at the time that you said, well, you thought that he had about 6 hours, if he had been treated 6 hours earlier, he would have survived.
Yes.
And if we add another 6.5 hours onto that, what that means is he had to be to the clinic, assuming the clinic treated him the same fashion as they did when they saw him on the night the evening involved. He had to be to the clinic either between around 8:50 a.m. or about 9:30 a.m. Isn't that a fair statement?
I think, well, maybe, yes, maybe that is so. However, please understand that when you go to a hospital, the hospital will, yes, you may have just about the right number of minutes in that equation, but it takes time. You're talking from the time of diagnosis. They have to make a diagnosis that he has meningitis. They have to examine and make sure that that's really what he has. Otherwise, they give him all the drugs in the world at that time when he just sets foot in the door. And mind you, he's already unconscious. So he's already far into the process.
Mr. Bruner was not unconscious at, by any record, at 9, well, let's give you the latest time, or the later time, at 9:30 a.m. on March 10, 2008, by any report, was it?
Well, they have to make a diagnosis before they inject him. They have to
In fact,
examine him, they have to do if they think of it, a spinal tap. They may do a CT scan of the head. I don't know what they do, but
in fact,
they have to.
in
We're
fact,
talking about
doctor,
from the time of diagnosis.
in fact, doctor, that before 9:30 a.m., there's no record that Mr. Bruner, that either of these two defendants, these deputies over here who were in the pod on March 10, there's no record that they were aware that Mr. Bruner hadn't been eating. You're aware of that, aren't you?
Well, like I told you before, the not eating is a result, not a cause. He didn't die of not eating. That is only a manifestation of disease, loss of appetite.
So what these two defendants saw, according to your information, is at about just shortly before that time frame, around 7:30-ish, 7:15-ish in the morning, was an individual who was acting confused. And
He's
you've indicated and acknowledged and admitted that there are lots of different sources for
He's
confusion out there.
confused, he's delusional, he hasn't got any energy whatsoever. He collapses or lies down on the floor where he happens to stand.
Wait, be careful with the question here. As of 9:30, there's no indication that he collapsed, is there?
Well, he's found on the floor in his...
At 2 p.m., sir.
At 2 p.m., that's earlier.
At 2 p.m., well after, by your calculations, there was any opportunity to save his life.
Objection. That's a mistake, Your Honor. Never said he just makes the calculation and it's a D7.
I think this witness can handle the question on cross-examination, so let's let him answer.
Do you remember the question?
Not really.
Yeah, that's all right. Tell you what, it's about lunch break, and you've been on the stand a long time, and I appreciate that. Let me ask one last question. Or maybe one, two. Mr. Bruner had end-stage liver disease, didn't he?
He had advanced cirrhosis of the liver.
All right. And end-stage liver disease, that's not curable by antibiotics, is it?
I'm sorry?
End-stage liver disease is not cured by antibiotics, is it?
No,
You got to have a liver transplant.
no.
Yes, meaning you have to have a liver transplant.
He would probably have to have a liver transplant.
I don't have anything else, thanks.
Unless you all object, we could go ahead and finish redirect, and then this witness will be done, and we'll take a lunch break at that time. Okay, go ahead.
Dr. Spitz, you weren't meaning to suggest, were you, that because the defendants didn't write anything down, that he didn't have any symptoms? He wasn't displaying symptoms?
No, he was displaying symptoms.
Well, they didn't write it down, so he must not have been displaying symptoms.
No, he was displaying symptoms, and they were not writing it down anyhow.
Okay.
Because they didn't look at him.
And if they did look at him, what did they see?
If they-
Your Honor, it's calling for speculation. The lack of foundation, he doesn't know anything as to how the pod is set up, and it's beyond the scope of his report.
In terms of, I'll restate, in terms of his symptoms, what would they see beginning at 7?
Objection, Your Honor, same reason.
Those were the questions he just asked, and I'm redirecting on it, Your Honor.
You're talking about at 7:15?
Beginning 7 o'clock, yes, or 10:15.
He can answer.
Thank you.
They would, I can answer, yes?
Yes, go ahead.
They would have seen an individual who is acutely ill and has belonged into a medical facility, into a hospital some time ago.
Now, you were asked a lot of different questions about meningitis, but there are a lot of different kinds of meningitis, aren't there?
Yes,
There's viral.
there's viral.
That doesn't even respond to antibiotics, does it?
Correct.
When we talk about this case, we're not talking first about meningitis, are we? What was the original cause?
The original cause was pneumonia
Well, what was the organism?
in the lung.
No, the organism. Strep?
It was Streptococcus pneumonia.
That's very common, isn't it?
That is very common.
That's not rare.
That is not.
That's not rare? That is not rare, is it?
I don't understand.
That's not a rare illness.
Oh, it's not rare. It's not rare. I said it's not rare earlier.
And
It's
people-
not a rare condition.
And people who suffer from it, even if they're immunocompromised, survive it, don't they?
Well, they would have to address the acute condition right there and then, whether they're immunocompromised or not. There are a lot of people who used to have AIDS. There are people who have cancer and are on cancer treatment for some reason or other. They are immunocompromised. But if a person has pneumonia, that has to be treated right there and then, compromised or not.
Right, that doesn't mean simply they're immunocompromised, so they're going to die, does it?
No.
Now, you were asked a bunch of questions. Mr. Chalmers pointed out some things for you in Exhibit 403. First of all, on Exhibit 403, it looks like Mr. Bruner was warned. He was given a tray but did not touch any food or drink, so he got a warning. Well, what did he do wrong?
He didn't do anything wrong.
The argument, or the question is argumentative, and there's no foundation for him to respond. Well, object to the question for that reason. I could go other things into, not at this time.
Isn't this beyond the scope of direct examination?
This is an exhibit that he used. Exhibit 403.
What page is it?
It's the only page. It's Defendant's Exhibit 403. I'll move on, Your Honor. You were asked, it said here, according to this, somebody put in 327, moved from cell location. Did you see that?
Yes.
Were you aware in this case that other people testified that they didn't even get to his cell, the mental health people, until after 3:45?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Well, how could he be moved from his cell at 3:27 if the people who went in there to find him came in at 3:45?
I have no explanation.
Okay. Well, let's assume he was taken somewhere between at 3:27 or thereafter, okay?
Yes.
Now, he was taken to another place in the jail. Mr. Chalmers kept referring to it as medical personnel. What doctor did he see?
I'm not aware of any doctor.
He didn't see any doctor, did he?
No.
In fact, the only person up there in that clinic is a physician's assistant named Fletcher, right?
Yes,
And for 6 hours, Mr. Fletcher did nothing for him, did he?
that's correct.
In fact, this is Exhibit 2 again. This is from the Sedgwick County Jail. This is the blood work that they did.
Yes,
Okay?
yes.
It says that the blood work was taken at what time?
At 4:10
Okay.
in the afternoon.
Okay. They got it back at what time?
At 6:08 in the afternoon.
You've seen this blood work before. It's part of the exhibits,
Yes.
and it's part of what you reviewed. Does this show that he is deathly ill?
Yes, it does.
Well, do you know why they waited another 4 hours then to send him to the hospital? If, according to Mr. Chalmers, he got sent at 10 o'clock. They get a report from the blood that he's deathly ill at 6 o'clock. Why would they wait another 4 hours to send him to the hospital?
I cannot tell you why they waited, but he's got a white blood count of 34.6 when the normal is 5 to 10.
Did they provide any care and treatment for him while he was in that jail, even when they had him with the physician's assistant? Anything?
No.
Finally, were you meaning to, I know you were asked a lot of questions, but were you meaning to suggest that the only way he could be saved is if they got him antibiotics at 9 o'clock, in light of the fact that they didn't do anything for him for 6 hours in this clinic?
No, with the opportunity for treatment here goes back a lengthy period.
If somebody at any time by 3 o'clock had hit, I want you to assume that they have the ability to call 911 and get him taken right immediately to Via Christi Hospital in 5 minutes. If somebody had done that by 3 o'clock, would he live?
Probably.
More likely than not?
More likely than not.
I have no further questions.
Any recross?
Just real briefly. Well, if at 3 o'clock someone hit the emergency button or whatever, called 911 and sent him to the hospital, he would likely survive. How about 4 o'clock?
You know, the longer you wait, the less chance there is.
How about 4 o'clock?
He probably would have lived too, but with the probability having maybe a little caveat with it.
How about,
A little caveat.
yeah. So at 2 o'clock would have been better than 3, 3 better than 4, 4 better than 5.
Obviously, the sooner you start
5
treatment-
o'clock would he likely survive if
No,
they
I
hit the
don't
emergency button and got him to the
I-
hospital?
I don't know, and I think this is an unfair question.
I
that you're
agree.
asking
I don't
me.
have any
I really don't know, and I don't want to answer that.
Okay. Then, Doctor, you are excused. Members of the jury, we'll take our luncheon recess. I'm going to let you make your first decision in this case. Do you want to recess for 30 minutes, 45, or 60? All in favor of 30? All right, we have a majority, so let's take a 30-minute recess, and then we'll get right back to work at 1:30. Court is in recess.
All rise.